Dragi gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu emisije Diplomata. Moja današnja sagovornica je stalna koordinatorka Ujedinjenih nacija u Srbiji, Matilde Mordt. Mrs. Matilde, thank you for taking the time of your day to speak with us and join us at our show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. This year, it's an important year for the UN. It marks 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. Looking back at these 8 decades of work, what do you see as the most important ways in which the UN has evolved, and why do you think it matters today?
So the United Nations was created in 1945, and as this charter says, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. So maintaining peace is of course in the center, but also socio-economic development and human rights. So at the start there were 51 founding members, and today it is a platform for 193 nations. It's actually the only global platform where every state has a voice. And this has been extremely important. You talk about evolution. So we've had many different landmarks throughout the years. Starting with the Charter, of course, but then very soon after we had the Human Rights Declaration in 1948. And successively there has been a number of international mechanisms to establish global governance. And another very important landmark at the beginning was also the Convention on the Protection of Refugees, for instance. 30 years ago, we had the Beijing Declaration on the rights of women, extremely important. The gender equality agenda has been very important in the last 30 years also. And more recently, we've had both the Paris Agreement on climate change and then, of course, Agenda 2030, which is what we work on the development side with the Sustainable Development Goal. So this is really remarkable because it's a platform where member states come together and define global agendas.
Yes.
But it's also important to remember that the UN is in the center are the member states, but we also have other sectors of society that are participating in these discussions and are feeding the agenda and are influencing the agenda. And I'm talking about civil society organizations. For instance, they were extremely important when the Human Rights Declaration was developed. If you remember at that time, in the US, for instance, we had the issue of segregation. So that was also the discussions that were behind that were also driving. You have private sector very much participating in the Sustainable Development Goals. There was a lot of contributions from the private sector. And so on. Academia is also part. And then the third part of the UN is actually we, the ones who work in the institutions and that implement, put into action what the member states decide. And we also contribute. We have expertise, we have platforms that are implementing on the ground. So we think about the UN as member states, which is correct, but there are also other parts. So actually this is a global conversation and it's an organization for global participation.
Of course. Now you've mentioned the Agenda 23, which was adopted by all UN member states during 2015, and this was a guide for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Where does Serbia stand on their SDGs today, and how can the UN actually help accelerate these goals as well?
If I may stay a little bit on the global part first, and then take the Serbian in a second part of the answer.
That's fine.
Because I do find the development of the Agenda 2030 was an extraordinary moment. And it's also important to look at this historically. So we had on the development side, there had been focus during decades on growth, on education, on health, etc. We had the Millennium Development Goals that were really fantastic in terms of it focused on poverty reduction, and it managed actually to bring out 1 billion people out of poverty in 15 years. But the whole development conversation was happening more on the social and economic side. There were some environmental aspects, but they were not really in center. And then you had the whole environmental conversation that was happening since 1972, the first environmental conference in Stockholm, and then subsequent conferences. And 92 was a very big moment in Rio, where we had 3 major conventions approved: the climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. But then, and from that came another set of commitments and conventions on the environmental side. But actually these two sides were not talking to each other. So when the world came together and said, how had we advanced on development goals, they also said we are missing a more integrated picture. So that's where the SDGs are born, the conversations about the SDGs, with a view of integrating economic issues, social issues, and environmental issues in an integrated way. And it's also important to mention this agenda was developed during 3 years of negotiations, and with member states, but also with all these different sectors that I was referring to before. So it's actually an agenda, and I'm saying this because there are parts of globally now that are seeing this as an imposed agenda. It was never an imposed agenda. It was an agenda that all countries could agree upon in a way that had never happened before in terms of participation and contributions and so on.
So it was a good example of that.
It's a fantastic example of how the UN comes together and the UN at its best. It wasn't easy because there were obviously the different countries have different views, but it was a blueprint for what we need as humanity to go forward.
Of course.
So I still think we have 5 years to go to 2030. Globally, there is still a lot of challenges. And what we have seen in the last years also, including conflicts, have obviously affected the advancement. And now I can go over to the Serbian side of the question. So Serbia has quite a solid record in terms of advancing on the SDGs. So there are 17 goals, 169 targets, and these are measured through different indicators. So the indicators we can see in Serbia are quite good in terms of health outcomes, for instance, child and maternal health. We also have good advances in gender equality, so women have a quite strong standing in the country. I mean, these are things to be celebrated, of course.
Of course.
Now, there are, of course, gaps, and we see a couple of them as the United Nations Development Team here. We are working with institutions, with civil society and other partners, international partners, on addressing these gaps. So let me take one of them, inequality, for instance. So there has been very good progress in Serbia in reducing poverty. So you have during several decades the poverty rates going down, but then it suddenly plateaus.
Yeah.
So what's happening with this plateau? This is normal. No, it gets more difficult to reach the most vulnerable groups. So you need to have more targeted programs. You need to have specific finance go into these groups. Who are the groups that are being left behind? Roma populations, rural populations, and elderly people, and particularly elderly women. So there is a need to have a special lens for attending these populations. So that is one of the areas that we're looking into. Another one I would mention, education has also been identified as stalling. So outcomes in education are not as good as they could be, and there's also an issue of reaching out again to the most left behind, rural areas, Roma population, and get quality services to these populations.
Of course.
And then I want to point to an area where there is a need to advance much faster, which is the environmental agenda. I mean, there are, of course, advances, and there have been several of them in the last couple of years. But things like the energy transition could go much faster, as we believe. And I think the current moment we have uncertainty in the energy sector. It is a moment where this could be taken to advantage to advance more quickly. Introducing renewables, but also working on energy efficiency. So we have very low energy efficiency in Serbia if you compare to the European average, for instance. Also on the adaptation side, so climate changes, emissions, which is the whole energy sector. And then on the adaptation side, there is also a need for more forceful advancement in terms of agriculture, for instance, or resilience of urban areas and so on.
Yes. Now, are there any maybe concrete UN-supported initiatives within Serbia that have directly affected the lives of people here that you would like to mention in this regard and in regard of SDGs as well?
We have many examples, of course. We work in we're several agencies, development agencies in Serbia, each working from their own angle with their own technical expertise. When possible, coming together to do also joint efforts in different sectors. Because one of the things that also came out from the SDG agenda discussions was that complex development problems cannot have only very small sectoral approaches. We need to have several institutions coming together. We need to have national and local coming together, different ministries to address different problems. And that's also how we like to work. We bring in different technical expertise. So we work on the economy and environment. We work on social protection and social issues. And then we work on the rule of law and human rights and gender equality very strongly. I mean, in very broad terms. So we have several agencies in these different parts. So maybe if I can talk to the social part, which Agenda 2030 also talks about leaving no one behind. It's a magnificent principle that can guide policy. And that's what we are also advocating for we're working, supporting institutions to accompany, for instance, housing projects for Roma population.
Very important,
I think we've had more than 28,000 beneficiaries throughout these years. And I'm coming to this integral part. So it's not only about housing and providing housing, it's also about looking through employment opportunities and see how we can accompany these communities to be employed, make sure that the children go to school, make sure that health services are provided also through health mediators. So there is a combination of actions that together aim at bringing these more vulnerable populations to advance. And that's only just one example.
And this ushers equal opportunities for everyone, even the endangered groups as such as well, yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, COP30 in Brazil is happening, and it is highlighting the renewed attention towards climate action. What are your expectations from this conference, and how can it help countries like Serbia strengthen their green transition above all?
Yes, so the COP30, which I think by the time this interview is aired has already finished, happened, but when we're having this conversation, it's ongoing. So we don't know actually what the end results will be, but I think the Brazilian presidency has been very skillful in pushing for this climate change conference to be centered on implementation. And why is this important? Because we often hear, well, we are seeing, greenhouse gas emissions are rising, we are having more extreme weather events and so on, and more climate variations. So we're asking ourselves, are all these negotiations actually working? And when you see the greenhouse gas emissions. So they are rising historically, and then we have the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement asks countries to present climate plans, all countries. So this was the big change in Paris, this was not only an issue for big emitters, which are obviously the most responsible still, certainly, but it was for all countries.
Everyone, yes.
So everybody had to present their climate plans, and in different moments these plans have been more ambitious, including in Serbia, and that's something that we have helped with. So if you take the current climate plans, you actually see if all the actions that are in those plans are implemented, we would actually have lowering of greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's very concrete.
If it's implemented, we will actually have a very strong result, because otherwise the projection was we continue rising, and we have this disturbed climate even more, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it's important to focus on, we have all these commitments, we have all these pledges, now we need to implement them. So what is the focus? As in all COPs, that happens every year and throughout the negotiations, focus is on finance. Because to be able to implement, countries need support, in financial support. And this is the responsibility of the big emitters also, right? To support countries that have not contributed to this problem to be able to invest. And for Serbia, this is extremely important. There is a need for an energy transition. The energy transition needs financing, but also other areas, and I can come back to that later. So that's one of the big topics that are always discussed, and there are different pledges, and there are always more need for financing than what is available. Although I would say that we have made quite large advancements in this. And
That's good to hear.
It's not only development assistance, it's very much the international financial system. So many of these finances come through loan agreements, but there is a lot of financing out there. The other part is we will have growing climate instability. So we're aiming for 1.5 degrees, staying below 1.5 degrees heating in comparison to pre-industrial levels, for 1990. But there will be changes. So the other focus of this COP is on adaptation. Countries need to prepare and adapt much more. And we're seeing it around the world. More floods, more hurricanes, recently devastating hurricanes in the Caribbean, in the Southeast Asia. Hundreds of people killed, and the economic impacts are huge. So countries need to prepare and be more resilient, and we need to work in all areas, in agriculture, in urban, in health, for instance, etc. And then the third thing that I would like to point out from this particular COP is this proposal from the Brazilian presidency of focusing on something they call the mutirão. The mutirão, I think in Serbian it would be MOBA. Okay, it's coming together collectively to make action. So it also calls on everyday citizens, on local municipalities and so on to really get together and see what we can do in our everyday life. And it has been calculated actually that if we change production and consumption patterns, 70% of emissions could actually change. So it's about transport systems, public transport, not everybody going in their own car to work, taking a bike. It's about eating less meat. I know that this is probably not popular here.
Especially not here.
But it's actually, if you look at climate projections, one of the things that impacts most, if everybody lowers their meat consumption, we really manage to get down the greenhouse gas emissions also.
I see.
So it's about changing also our everyday lives, and this is what the mutirão is about.
So the action needs to be taken from the ground all the way up to states and international actors.
It's policy, it's implementation, and it's local action and individual action.
Now, Serbia has updated its national commitments towards climate. From the UN's perspective, how can Serbia turn these commitments into opportunities in order to achieve the green transition and achieve new green jobs, as well, especially in fields like you mentioned, transition, agriculture, and of course, urban development?
Yes, so first I think we need to recognize this increased ambition, which is also what the Climate Change Convention is asking for. Countries need to have increased ambition. This is the third climate plan of Serbia. They're called National Determined Contributions, NDCs. So the first NDC of Serbia identified a reduction in greenhouse gas emission of 9%, something like that. Now, this third edition is 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emission, which should be recognized. And I understand that it's also very seriously connected to investment projects that are in the pipeline or being done already, or changes have been done. So this ambition is related to very much the energy transition, of course. So Serbia aims to reach 45% renewables by 2030. That's only in 5 years' time.
5 years' time.
So it goes back to what I was saying before. This is an opportunity also to advance this transition more rapidly. And this investment can create thousands of jobs. There is a worry about the transition out from coal, which is needed because the other side of this is the pollution part.
Yes.
So we are now in the winter season. We are seeing the pollution coming back. It's affecting health. It's affecting the economy. And this is a way also of having not only, I mean, this is an opportunity to shift employment from these coal-based sectors to the new renewable sectors. And we will have to accompany this with training, with skills, with technology, etc., because these are relatively new. So I do hope that Serbia manages to advance in this, and we are supporting also this transition in different ways. We're working with investments in small and medium-sized companies for environmental or greening, and that's...
And for them, this is the biggest obstacle, because financially as well, they have to go through them, and which is a big challenge, especially when they're smaller businesses.
Exactly. Yeah. So this, back to the financing part. Yes. So this is an example of how this looks, not in the global negotiations, but on the ground. Yeah. So you have UNDP providing technical assistance to these small and medium-sized enterprises, and then you have the European Investment Bank providing finance to local banks that then provide financing to these SMEs. So it's a very concrete example of how you can accompany this transition.
Absolutely.
Another area is agriculture, as I mentioned. So we have been also supporting the adaptation of in this sector in terms of more resilient crops, more receptive also agricultural sector and agricultural households and so on. So this can also lead to increased productivity. There's no secret we've had very high losses in the agricultural sector in the last 2 summers due to drought. So this is a change that is absolutely needed and where we're also accompanying. And the last sector that I would like to point out is urban development. We need to adapt our cities to be more resilient. And it's not only resilience towards floods, but also to heats. So for instance, we have supported Belgrade in doing a green infrastructure plan that could help having more resilience in the city. So we also look forward to see the implementation of this plan in the future.
Of course, it's certainly a good thing to hear, especially in Belgrade. We know how the summers can get here.
It's hot. We
so
need
it's more than needed, yes.
More green areas, more trees, more shade.
Absolutely.
It's really important.
Now, you also mentioned gender equality as an important topic of the work of the UN. Now, Serbia shows relatively good indicators in some areas of gender equality, yet some important gaps remain. How does the UN work with national partners to actually advance women's empowerment and address gender-based violence? And this is particularly ahead of the 16 Days of Activism campaign.
Indeed. So again, I think Serbia deserves recognition for its status in terms of gender equality. You have women are highly educated here. There are quite visible also in public life. And actually one aspect that the UN has been helping with through UN Women is the gender responsive budgeting, which again goes back to the financing part. We are ensuring that investments are done where women and girls need it, in local governments, but also at the national level. This is actually Serbia is recognized for this globally, so I think it's something to be very proud of. Now, there are, of course, challenges. If you see, you know, if you touch upon the human stories of this, there are another aspect that we see. Women still have less access to the labor market. There is a gap between participation in the labor market between women and men. When they work, they have a double burden of both paid and unpaid work, which has very much to do with how we distribute household burdens, or household chores in the household. And then what you were referring to, the issue of gender-based violence. It's really tragic when you speak to victims, when you speak to the different institutions that are involved in responding to this, when you speak to the police, when you speak to social workers, the health sector and so on. It's tragic to see. These are lives that are being affected. These are children that are perhaps witnessing violence and so on. So the United Nations works in different aspects. One is the prevention, of course. It's really, really important to change social norms and stereotypes and inequalities that are actually accumulating over the years. And this also includes behavioral change initiatives with men and boys, because the whole society is into this. In terms of how we respond to emergencies, we are also supporting different sectors. And again, I come back to the issue of these are integrated responses. This is complex challenges that need responses from different parts of society. So here we have the police is involved, the health sector is involved, the social sector is involved, and we need to, the judiciary, of course. Yes. So we need to have a coherent way of responding to when there is an emergency, and we need to have a response that is focused on the victim and not on the institution and how the institution usually does things, because we need to have this empathy and treat these victims in a proper way. So we are working with all these different parts of society in this area. And just to go back to the prevention part, that leads me to this campaign, which is every year, the 16-day activism against violence against women and girls. And this year the focus is on digital spaces, and so we need to make the digital space a safe space, because we are seeing many attacks on girls, on women, on professionals, not necessarily, you know, we talk about teenagers and how they are affected, but this is also happening with professionals, with journalists, with activists, with politicians also. So there is a conversation that needs to be held in terms of how we regulate these spaces, but also how we behave in these spaces. So this is what this 16 days is about. And this is also about taking responsibility in terms of reporting abuse, supporting survivors, and challenging harmful narratives.
Now, another important issue that you mentioned in your previous answers was poverty. And the UN highlights that poverty is multidimensional, so it's not just about income, but access to healthcare, education, and social inclusion as well. What do you see as the main drivers of poverty today, and how can policies actually better respond to them?
No, definitely. This is absolutely true globally. Poverty is a concept that is multidimensional. Obviously, income is a very important part of the poverty, and that's how you measure poverty generally.
But it's not the only aspect.
It's definitely not the only aspect. This is about housing, this is about education, it's also access to health. Let me give you an example. You have, we were talking about vulnerable populations previously.
Yes.
An indicator that struck me when I arrived here, when I heard that Roma population has a life expectancy of 12 years less than the Serbian average. 12 years less is a huge number.
Absolutely.
In terms of life expectancy. I mean, having a lower life expectancy. And this is the reflection of this multidimensional situation. It's probably lack of income, of course, or income opportunities. It's lack of access to housing. It's lack of access to health. It's lack of access to education. It's also related to child marriages and so on. So it's something that needs to be addressed, yes, from different institutions, but in a collective manner, so we get better results. Now, if we go to the income part, we have 20%, almost 20% of the Serbian population is what we call at risk of poverty. At risk of poverty is that any shock can affect you and you can fall into poverty. So employment, of course, is one of the key measures that makes you less vulnerable to these shocks. But if there are shocks, what we need to have is social protection systems that also give more resilience to emergency situations. So you have social programs that attend the day-to-day needs of certain populations, but then you also need to have particular look at these vulnerable groups, what can happen to them and how can we support. For instance, if there is a health emergency and there's a lot of out-of-pocket payment for health, that needs to be addressed through other programs, for instance.
Yeah, so they need safety nets for these situations, absolutely. Now, for the last question, as the UN marks its 80th anniversary, as we mentioned, what lessons from the past 8 decades should guide global cooperation in the years ahead? And what role do you see countries like Serbia playing in shaping that future?
So we're closing this conversation where we started at the global level, and I do appreciate that because I think we have seen in these 80 years that global collaboration works. We've had tremendous impacts that we're perhaps not aware of. So smallpox has been eradicated. That was a collective effort by all member states.
Certainly.
We managed to get 1 billion people out of poverty in the MDG era in just 15 years, because there was a collective focus on poverty reduction.
It's a big success, certainly.
On the environmental side, we have the Montreal Protocol, and many people might not have heard about the Montreal Protocol, but actually the Montreal Protocol has helped us heal the ozone layer, which was, we had this a couple of decades ago, we had this big ozone hole.
Yes, in the layers.
And we stopped using aerosols and other chemicals that affect this ozone layer, and that has now been reversed. So these are examples of how we can come together collectively, of course. And so these global challenges, they require also shared solutions. And this is going to continue to be so. There's no way the challenges of today, like climate change that we spoke about, or inequality, can be solved by any single nation on its own. Now, there is also an ongoing conversation about the needs for UN reform. At the political level and related to the peace dimension, there is, of course, a lot of focus on the Security Council. The structure was created in 1945. It was a very different world than when we have today. We will see how far these conversations can advance within the United Nations and between member states. But also on other pillars, there are conversations on how we can be more effective operationally, how we can review our mandates. We are given a number of mandates by member states, and many of these are never sunsetted, or there's no clause for when they end or when they should be reviewed.
Yes.
So that's an important, because we keep adding on different mandates, and it's really difficult for the UN as an institution to respond to all this, but it's also impossible for member states to really be able to follow up on this. So that's the second part of it. One is operational, the second is mandate review. And the third is also how we are structured organizationally. So there is room. So again, there has been different entities that have been created throughout the years, and this is a good moment. We are also in a financial crisis, or very challenged in terms of the financial contributions to the UN. So it's a good opportunity also to review how we are structured in terms of organization and entities, and see if this is a moment to reduce overlapping mandates and make us more streamlined. So this is ongoing as we sit here. Proposals will be presented to member states, and it's up to the member states to take decisions. And it's really important for us that the member states really take this opportunity also to help shaping the UN of the future. And in terms of Serbia, that is also very much what we see from Serbia and expect from Serbia. Serbia is very strong in terms of multilateralism. Yugoslavia was a founding member in 1951, and it's not only a partner that we work in in Serbia and on the ground, but Serbia is also very much active globally. It contributes to peacekeeping operations, for instance, and it is active also in this global conversation that is happening right now.
Well, that's certainly good to hear. It's safe to say that a lot of work has been done, but there's still room to work with there. Thank you once again for taking the time off your day to speak with us for our show. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
A našim dragim gledaocima hvala na pažnji. Gledali ste razgovor sa stalnom koordinatorkom Ujedinjenih nacija u Srbiji Matilde Mordt. Ostanite uz nas jer dalje idu diplomatski događaji i diplomatske vesti.
Meksička ulica, novo ime na mapi Beograda, svečano je otvorena u Beogradu na vodi u prisustvu gradskih i državnih predstavnika, ambasadora, predstavnika medija i članova Meksičke zajednice. Događaj je označio početak programa zajedničkih aktivnosti povodom obeležavanja 80. godišnjice diplomatskih odnosa između Meksika i Srbije sledeće godine.
Ovo je istorijski dan za odnose između naše dve države, a posebno za građane Beograda. Meksiko je oduvek bio blizak srpskom narodu. Moja supruga i ja smo svedoci te bliskosti. Prvi put smo živeli u Beogradu od 1991. do 1994. godine i zajedno smo sa Beograđanima delili veoma tužne i bolne trenutke. U tim teškim godinama grad Beograd i njegovi stanovnici prkosili su ozbiljnim nedaćama, ne posustajući i sa otpornošću koja je ponovo pokazala herojski karakter ovog grada. Tokom tog teškog perioda Meksiko je uvek držao vrata svoje ambasade otvorenim u znak solidarnosti sa srpskim narodom i pružao je podršku teritorijalnom integritetu i suverenitetu Srbije nad pokrajinom Kosovo i Metohije. Drugi put kad smo se vratili u Beograd, uverili smo se da se ponovo podigao i izvojevao još jednu herojsku bitku, opet zahvaljujući hrabrosti i otpornosti srpskog naroda.
Otvaranje Meksičke ulice rezultat je zajedničke saradnje između ambasade Meksika u Srbiji i Skupštine grada Beograda, kao i snažnih prijateljskih veza između naroda dve zemlje.
Kao što u Meksiko Cityu već dugi niz godina postoji ulica Beograd, Kalje Belgrado, tako danas i naš grad uzvraća istom merom uvažavanja. Naše dve prestonice, Beograd i Meksiko City, imaju ogroman potencijal za jačanje saradnje u ekonomiji, kulturi, obrazovanju, inovacijama i svim onim oblastima koje spajaju savremene gradove i stvaraju nove mogućnosti za njihove građane. I ubeđen sam da će ova ulica postati mesto novih susreta, ideja, partnerstava, pa i ljubavi.
Bliski odnosi između naših zemalja datiraju već decenijama i želim da podsjetim da je još daleke 1985. godine nekadašnji predsjednik Meksika Miguel de la Madrid dobio počasno zvanje počasni građanin Beograda, što ima jako mali broj ljudi iz čitavog sveta. Meksička ulica nije samo adresa, ona je novi urbani prostor koji manifestuje volju da gradimo mostove razumevanja, partnerstva i trajnog dijaloga sa prijateljskim zemljama. Verujem da ćemo u bliskoj budućnosti saradnju naša dva grada podići na jedan viši nivo i da ćemo vrlo brzo moći da potpišemo sporazum o bratimljenju Beograda i Meksiko Citya.
Meksička ulica nalazi se preko puta Palate pravde u produžetku Risanske ulice. Povodom njenog otvaranja organizovan je kulturno-umetnički program sa ciljem promovisanja igara, nošnji i tradicije Meksika. Portugalska ambasada u Beogradu i Narodna biblioteka Srbije priredili su izložbu Prevodilac, zavodilac, tekstovi u tranzitu između portugalskog i srpskog, kao deo obeležavanja 2 decenije nastave portugalskog jezika na Filozofskom fakultetu u Beogradu, gde autor izložbe radi kao predavač. U središtu izložbe su prevodioci koji svojim radom grade trajne mostove između Beograda i Lisabona, zahvaljujući kojima se književnosti prepoznaju i prožimaju.
U današnje vreme, kada je sve dominantnija veštačka inteligencija i različiti programi za automatsko prevođenje, uloga prevodioca je možda važnija nego ikada. Baš zato što samo kroz ljude možemo da osetimo ono humano u drugome, da ga upoznamo i da nam približi suštinu nekog bića. Zato prevod sa srpskog na portugalski i portugalskog na srpski donosi sve te različite svetove i kulture u kojima se govori portugalski jezik širom sveta.
Na izložbi su bile predstavljene knjige i plakati koji slave književnost autora iz delova sveta gde se govori portugalski i put te književnosti do Srbije.
Veliko mi je zadovoljstvo da je u Narodnoj biblioteci Srbije, koja je naravno kao jedna od najznačajnijih ustanova kulture u Srbiji i u Beogradu, uvek otvorena za ovakve događaje, da imamo jednu izuzetnu izložbu posvećenu prevođenju, posvećenu Portugalu, portugalskom jeziku, portugalskoj književnosti, portugalskoj kulturi i mislim da je njeno i pravo mesto ovde u ovom prostoru Narodne biblioteke koja predstavlja mesto susretanja mnogih kultura i naravno susretanja književnosti i svega onog što nas spaja.
Kada sam se pripremao da napišem ovaj govor, imao sam jednu sliku koja mi je stalno dolazila u misli, a to je slika vavilonskog mita. Kako i ne bi kada se nalazimo u ovom mestu koje, pošto je biblioteka, sadrži sve snove ovoga sveta, kao što je govorio Fernando Pessoa. U prevođenju baš i ne vidim sebe, jer je to jedna idealistička pozicija o kojoj bih radije razmišljao kao u trenutku prevazilaženja nerazumevanja. Vavilon je dakle simbolika nemogućnosti komunikacije koja proizilazi iz slučajnosti, jedna bučna tišina koja se nastavlja i potreba da se nađe način da se stigne na drugu stranu.
Izložba Prevodilac, zavodilac, tekstovi u tranzitu između portugalskog i srpskog bila je otvorena za posetioce do petka 28. novembra. Avivit Barilan, ambasadorka Izraela i njen suprug organizovali su svečani koktel u rezidenciji u Beogradu na kojem su gošće iz izraelske kompanije Eden predstavile izraelske vinske etikete. Gosti su imali priliku da se upoznaju sa vinima nastalim od sorti sa visoravni i brežuljaka severa, pa sve do pustinje na jugu Izraela. Posebno dirljiv trenutak bilo je otvaranje specijalne edicije takozvanog vina Nade, koje je za tu priliku pripremila porodica Alona Ohela, izraelsko-srpskog državljanina koji je nedavno oslobođen iz zatočeništva u Gazi. Pored izraelskih vina predstavljena su vina vinarije 100 žena, čije su predstavnice bile počasne gošće na događaju. U okviru zvanične posete nigerijske kraljevske kuće od Uduva kraljevskoj porodici Karađorđević, Adesegun Temitope, kraljica majka Unije afričke dijaspore, uručila je Muzeju afričke umetnosti poseban poklon. Zajedno sa jednim savremenim umetničkim delom uručena je bronzana glava Ori Olokuna, koja predstavlja drevni simbol kraljevskog nasleđa i simbolično svedočanstvo bogate istorije i živopisne kulture Nigerije. Srpsku delegaciju činili su princ Filip i princeza Danica Karađorđević, Stanko Blagojević, pomoćnik ministra kulture, kao i drugi predstavnici zvaničnih institucija. Ova poseta je značajan kulturni događaj kojim se ujedno jačaju bilateralne veze između Srbije i Nigerije, dok je publika u Beogradu dobila jedinstvenu priliku da se bolje upozna sa nasleđem afričke umetnosti.